All right, guys, so here we are in our next section, the cycles of matter, which is section 13.5. Our key concept, matter cycles in and out of an ecosystem. We have some new vocabulary, which is biogeochemical cycle, hydrologic cycle, oxygen cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen fixation, phosphorus cycle, limiting nutrient, and algal bloom. So our essential question, how does matter cycle in and out of an ecosystem? Well, first things first. Elements essential for life cycle through our ecosystems. We call them biogeochemical cycles, or the cycling of substances. And those pathways through which chemical elements or molecules move through both the biotic, the living, and the abiotic, the non-living parts of the earth. We have 5 specific cycles we're going to talk about, which is hydrologic cycle. You've heard of it. We've done that before. You've learned about it. It's just a fancy term for water cycle. We have the oxygen cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. So here we are in our first cycle. Our first cycle is the water cycle, also called the hydrologic cycle. Now you've learned about the water cycle since you were in like elementary school, right? We learned that rain or snow or sleet or hail falls from the sky. That's called precipitation. Falls down to the earth and it lands on mountains, oceans, the ground. When it runs off mountains and things like that, we call it runoff. Sometimes it seeps down into the earth, becoming groundwater, and it collects in things called aquifers. And actually, Florida's full of aquifers, and that's where we collect a lot of our fresh water. That seeps down and eventually finds its way from lakes and rivers and streams into the oceans, where it evaporates again, goes up into the atmosphere, condenses, forming clouds, and then it falls back to the sky via precipitation. Now, another thing that you probably have not heard of is that plants also lose water. Now, plants, when they go through cellular respiration, they release water, and they release water through a process called transpiration. And that's really important for us to remember, that word transpiration is the water loss through these little holes in the plant's leaves called stomata, and that's when they release their water. Also, oxygen cycles through our environment, and it does through indirectly through ecosystems by the cycling of other nutrients, more like with our carbon cycle, when we take in the oxygen from photosynthesis, we breathe it in, we release carbon dioxide. So the main processes involved in the oxygen cycle are photosynthesis and then respiration or cellular respiration. And again, it's part of the carbon cycle. So carbon is the building block of life, and carbon moves through the environment through several different ways, and it moves also through our food web, and it also is in our atmosphere. Carbon's emitted not only just from cellular respiration and carbon dioxide, but it's also emitted by the burning of fossil fuels. Okay, and that can be very, very detrimental. As we know, global warming is because of the burning of fossil fuels, because we have a huge amount of carbon dioxide in our environment. We also have carbon dioxide stored for long periods of time called carbon sinks that are found deep in the earth, and especially underneath some of the ice and things in the Arctic. And that's what scientists are really worried about with some of these carbon sinks that are hidden away, little pockets of carbon that as that ice melts, more carbon is going to enter our atmosphere. So the heating up of our world is a really, really detrimental thing, because it's going to also release carbon that's been stored for a long period of time underneath the ice. We also have a thing called the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle takes place mostly underground, and I should need to go back, but mostly all of nitrogen is atmospheric nitrogen that is not usable. Okay, so something has to happen to that nitrogen in our atmosphere for us to actually use it. It needs to be in a form that organisms can actually use. And the process by which atmospheric nitrogen is converted into a form that organisms can use is called nitrogen fixation. Now, a couple different types of organisms, bacteria, and also lightning help to convert nitrogen into their usable forms. Some of those nitrogen-fixing bacteria live on little nodules, little bumps on the roots of plants. Some of them also live freely in the soil, but nitrogen fixation is super important because that atmospheric nitrogen, the nitrogen that we can't use, even though the air is full of nitrogen, we can't use it. We need it to be fixed first into that form we can use. Now, some of the steps to that. Ammonia is released into the soil and then is transformed into a product called ammonium. That bacteria then change ammonium to nitrate. Okay, that nitrate gets taken in. Okay, and then nitrogen moves through the food web by eating things that use that nitrogen to grow, specifically plants, and that returns to the soil in decomposition. We also have a thing called the phosphorus cycle. This also takes place at and below the ground level. Phosphate is actually released by the weathering of rocks. And phosphorus moves through the food chain, so it's released by the weathering of rocks down into the soil, okay? Goes into our plants for helping them grow. It also can end up in our groundwater, okay? Locked in sediments. And then also when we do mining or we grow plants, we add phosphorus into that environment to help those plants grow. Same thing when we add nitrogen also to our plants to help them grow. So phosphorus and nitrogen are critical for helping plants grow, but we don't always have enough of them. That brings me to my next thing, which is nutrient limitation. If plenty of sunlight and water are available, productivity in the environment may be limited due to the availability of other nutrients, more specifically that phosphorus and that nitrogen. And so a nutrient whose supply is limiting productivity is called a limiting nutrient, okay? And if we add those, then of course we can grow more crops and do more things, okay? So growth of plants, especially crop plants, can be limited by one or more nutrients, and this is exactly why farmers add fertilizer to the fields. The fertilizers contain those large amount of nutrients to help those plants grow better. Now, what happens, unfortunately, when we add those things to growing crops, well, that nitrogen, that phosphorus, those other chemicals that are those nutrients are helping plants grow, don't just go into the plants. A lot of them get washed away when it rains. And so what happens is they get washed down into our oceans and into our streams and other bodies of water. And oceans are typically very nutrient poor environments compared to our actual land. The seawater only contains 1/10,000 of the amount of nitrogen that land actually does. So nitrogen in our oceans can become a limiting factor for big amounts like plants. What are plants that live in water? Algae. So after heavy rains, that aquatic ecosystem can receive a large amount of that limiting factor due to rain runoff. So what happens is that nitrogen, that phosphate, ends up down in our oceans. Now, because of this, the plants in the ocean can start to grow out of control because they're getting a lot of these nutrients that they don't normally get. So when this happens, the result can be a thing called an algal bloom, which is a huge increase in algae, and that's important to remember. Usually they have some kind of reading on the EOC about if the ocean receives a limiting nutrient, what can happen, and that's called an algal bloom. The plants in the ocean start to grow out of control. All right, that is it for our cycles of matter. You are going to move on to assignment number 5, which you are going to be drawing pictures or diagrams of each of the cycles, okay? You're going to do that in your notebook, and then you're going to label them, and then you're going to use your notes to just write a summary about what's happening in each of those cycles. All right, guys, have a good one.